You're listening to a Countout Podcast. Welcome to The Ballot, the podcast where the conversation begins. I'm your host, Ryan Knightsey. We here are, of course, talking about the Wrestling Observer newsletter Hall of Fame ballots that will be, I guess, technically fully unveiled this October, right? October is when they typically happen. We talked about the recorded thing. We had Io Shirai, Io Sky conversations. And then after that, we had Sabu. We did that sort of special episode about Sabu. Who is obviously not currently on the ballot, but presumed will be based off of Dave's conversation. Got a lot of good feedback about that, so I want to thank everybody for their thoughts and their opinions and kind words towards me and that podcast. But this wouldn't be the ballot. This would, there's there's a lot of people that say these sort of things, but there's no other podcast out there that is probably going to discuss in a 3-episode period Io Shirai, Sabu, and today's topic, which is, of course, going all the way into 1940s, 50s, 60s French catch wrestling. Today we are talking about, and we've been practicing this before we recorded, Gilbert Leduc. I think that's pretty good. I think it's all right. We'll get a confirmation if that was okay from our guest today, which is, of course, wrestling historian, Phil Lyons. Phil, welcome to the show. Welcome to the ballot. Thank you for taking the time out to talk about Leduc.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to talking Leduc.
And how would you pronounce Leduc? Was that good? I feel like that was fine.
Yeah, the last name is fine. Now, the first one, that's the trickier one, because obviously your natural instinct as an English speaker, and mine as well, is to say Gilbert, obviously English pronunciation. Yep. But technically in French, it was Gilbert, and you said it pretty good. So that's correct. And I'll say right off the bat, as I'm discussing him, I'll probably end up switching between the two without realizing. So if you hear Gilbert, if you hear Gilbert, obviously same guy, just saying it differently for whatever reason. And the last name, actually, speaking of names,
yes,
just to bring this up because people sometimes get it wrong, he wasn't a lumberjack from Montreal. So in other words, the name is spelled Leduc, lowercase d. There is no capital D in the middle, just to put this out there as well.
Yeah, that is the American in me. It so badly wants to do. I don't know what it is. I don't know what specifically it is, because it's not like the Leducs in America, or I guess rather Canada, weren't like, I don't know. I guess they were popular, but not like in like modern American parlance. They're not like massive names. But there's something about that in particular where the American in me wants to say Gilbert Leduc, capital D. I don't know what it is. I can't pinpoint what it is, but that's my nasty American coming out, I guess. Well, of course, we're talking about Leduc, and I will just probably say the name Leduc moving forward, but a lot to talk about with him. Obviously, he is on the Rest of the World ballot, joining a plethora of newbies this year. I think there was 4 total of new guys, plus, whoever was on previously. It's a small category, of course, but a lot of new names, new fresh faces. And much like many of the other episodes that I have done with all of our new guests, Phil, I wanted to ask you first, what is your sort of connection with Leduc?
I don't know that I necessarily have one. Mm-hmm. My connection is more so with French, well, not even just French catch, just French pro wrestling in general, because when I started researching wrestling history, I would say almost 20 years ago. Wow, do I feel old? But anyway, almost 20 years ago, France was actually the first territory I researched, more so the 30s at that point. But then as I continued researching it over time, and especially after the footage of it became available, the French catch footage, that's when I really kind of got into it. And Leduc is one of the guys who stood out to me as the most significant guys. And so, I don't necessarily have a personal connection, so to speak, to him. He is one of my French favorites.
What about French wrestling, I guess, drew you in at first?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, because I'm originally from Bulgaria, and there is this legendary in Bulgaria professional wrestler called Dan Koloff, who's actually on the ballot. Not on the ballot, in the Hall of Fame now. as a historical name. He went in a few years ago, and he was actually huge in France. So I wanted to research him. So that's how it started. So that's the first aspect of it. But the second aspect is that just France has an extensive network of libraries and newspapers available online. So it was just easy to search. So that was another aspect to it.
That's fantastic. Well, let's talk about it. So I think a big important part about Leduc, and obviously we'll talk about him and his career and all those sort of categories. But similarly to sort of the Ted Boy Marino episode that we did, and we had discussions, and this was also a big priority for you, just like it was for Verb Abrams on the Ted Boy episode, is talking about the territory that was France and how that operated. Because, I think it's fair to say, especially for, I would say most people, just because of how, it's been decades since the French territory was really booming, let's say. But especially since it's so under-researched in those decades for reasons we can maybe discuss in a moment. But, I think it's important to give the context of how the French system worked, because it isn't quite the same as how American wrestling process. It kind of started that way, I guess, to a certain degree. And I know there's elements to it, but it works differently. Let's start there. Let's talk about the history of French wrestling. Phil, I'll just open the doors for you. I want to give people the context at home too. I did research. I talked about this, but one of the reasons I'm so happy to have Phil Lyons on the show discussing this today is a lot of the research that you would find out there that has been done about French catch wrestling has been presented and correlated and presented by Phil here. So Phil, the door is open for you. Let's talk about the French history of wrestling. How did it all begin, and how did we get up to Leduc?
Mm-hmm. But before we do, actually, you mentioned something that actually it's a good side note to just plug in. The last French boom was in 2008, 2009, 2010.
Sure.
Because WWE got on one of the big free-to-air networks. Wrestling got super popular. The local promotions reaped the benefits of it. So technically, that was the last boom, just to mention this. Although that was obviously more so American-based, so to speak. Now, in terms of history, I'll first say this. I don't think most people realize how historically significant France has been to the development and just the history of professional wrestling in general. And when I say professional wrestling, I really mean from the very beginning, because professional wrestling, as we know it, it actually started in France way back in the 1830s. That's 1/8, not 1/9, just to clarify. So essentially back then, they introduced what would eventually become known as Greco-Roman type of wrestling, professional wrestling. And over time, this style really was the first major professional style all across Europe, and specifically towards the late 19th century and early 20th century. It was incredibly popular all across Europe, everywhere really, had a big scene usually. So they had that going for them. Then towards the end of the first decade, I would say, of the 20th century, the style lost its appeal to the mass audience. And I'll just mention a quick note here. A big reason why it lost its appeal is because a lot of faking was going on and people caught on to it. So for the people that think that wrestling has been worked for a little bit, no, it's been worked for a long time.
You're telling me the audience knew that too. I thought that didn't happen to the curtain call.
Right. Yeah. So so that's kind of what happened. And then in the early 1910s, there was a bit of an attempt to get the catch as catch can style popular in France. It worked to an extent, but then obviously World War I happened and everything was put to a halt. And in general, the catch as catch can style in Europe never really took off. It was only popular in the UK, but in mainland Europe, it never really took off. Now, fast forward to the 1930s. Now, there was a French athlete, like a multi-sport athlete. I mean, a champion in a number of different sports. He was at the Olympics in several different sports, even won, I think, a silver or bronze medal in one of the sports. There was a guy by the name of Raoul Pauli. So Pauli, in the 1920s, went over to the United States to do some acting in movies. And that's where he developed an interest in American-style professional wrestling. And that's when he actually reconnected with an old friend of his by the name of Henri Deglan, or Henry Deglan, if you want to do the American pronunciation. So Deglan was an Olympic gold medalist from the 1924 Paris Olympics, who then became a professional. Well, actually, I should say he started as a professional, then became an amateur, then went back to being a professional. Long story, we won't go into it. But anyway, so Deglan at the time was developing quite a reputation in the States and eventually even became the world champion in the infamous Montreal screw job, the first one, when he took the title away from Strangler Lewis in Montreal in 1931. Mm-hmm. So Paulie and Deglan, they reconnected. Deglan even trained Paulie. Paulie wrestled professionally for a little bit, even though he was in his early 40s. So long story short, Paulie had this idea in his head that he wanted to bring over this style of wrestling, the American style of wrestling, over to France. And he did so. In 1933, September to be precise, he promoted his first show in Paris, and he partnered up with Deglan, who at this point had already lost the world championship, but obviously a former champion, very well known, etc. So essentially the way things worked, Paulie was the promoter and Deglan was the top star. There were some other top stars, like the guy that I mentioned earlier, Dan Koloff was one of them. There was also an Olympic gold medalist in weightlifting, Charles Rigoulot, who was also a big star. So those three guys were kind of the nucleus of it. So they started promoting, Paulie started promoting, first show, major success, over 10,000 people for the first show. How many promoters in history can say that? Not many. So from there, wrestling became very popular in France. And this is where the influence part comes into play from France. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that France was solely responsible for it, but France had a lot of influence of the style, which I'll clarify. He brought in over an American style of professional wrestling, but obviously he put his own French twist to it. Sure. So, and this is actually where, because obviously in the States, it was typically called wrestling. Obviously, there was the whole term catch as catch can. But as far as just the word itself, just catch, short and abbreviated, branded like that, that actually happened in France. And from there, that branding, so to speak, that style of wrestling started spreading throughout Europe. And in a lot of countries, actually, like Bulgaria, like Portugal, like Spain, guys from the Paulie promotion were the first sort of guys to do shows in that style. So in that sense, his promotion in France in general was very influential in spreading the American style, what we know as professional wrestling, throughout Europe. So then obviously World War II happens. There's essentially a change in the political regime. The new regime bans all professional sports, including wrestling. So between 1940, 1944, no wrestling, of course. Then it comes back in 1944. Like a year later, Paulie is back in the mix. The crowds are once again big. So it just continues on from there. Now, in 1949, that's the other kind of next evolution of it. In 1949, television started in France. And very early on, wrestling became featured on television, but not in the traditional sense. What I mean by that is, back then on the news, they would have these blocks where they would show highlights from different sports. And very often wrestling was one of the sports featured, where they would show anywhere from a couple of minutes to maybe 4 or 5 minutes of a match. So that started happening. Then in 1954 was the first actual live broadcast, which, fun fact, the very first match in French pro wrestling history featured Primo Carnera, who former boxing world champion and a big wrestling star after that as well. But anyway, eventually a couple of years later, wrestling started airing regularly on television. And at this point, even though it had been popular before, up to that point, it continued growing more and more in popularity. They introduced some new concepts in the late 50s. It exploded even more. So that's really the peak of it, like I would say late 50s to early 60s. Then, of course, it continued on to I would say maybe the late 60s. Things were pretty good. In the late 60s is where you start to see a bit of a decline. Then by the late 70s, it's really declined. I mean, it's still around, but it's just no longer mainstream and no longer culturally relevant. And it continued on TV until 85 when it got dropped. And that's pretty much where I'll end it. I mean, the scene continued on, but it was nothing like it had been before by that point. So long story short, this is a brief summary of the history of professional wrestling in France.
You talked about TV wrestling in France starting, and I know that in French catch, there are a number of promoters who are all sort of competitive, but also working together. If I had, for American listeners, that's probably like the closest sort of idea of like the territory NWA system, I guess you could say, is that they're all sort of basically, I believe, working in Paris or the greater Parisian area. Obviously, definitely France, but they're all sort of working together because they're all kind of working from the same talent pool, or these booking hall offices, and working from the same talent pools. For the TV in France, did that start with one specific promoter, or is that just all promoters were able to jump in on the TV front?
Well, from what I've been able to find, initially when you say the TV, because there's obviously the highlights and then there's the actual broadcasts.
Sure.
I'll say for the actual broadcast, it was two promoters. So what happened is Paul Lee eventually joined forces and merged his promotion with another promoter by the name of Alex Goldstein. So they became one promotion. So initially, as best as I can tell, they were the first two to get their matches featured on TV. But eventually, a deal got worked out to where all the Paris promoters... Actually, let me take a step back here and just explain one quick thing. Now, the French territory, the way it worked, it wasn't divided into areas like the United States was, for example. They were all operating within the same territory. So essentially, there could be a case where all four are running shows in the same town, obviously with different promoters. So when I say all four, I mean that generally there were four major promotions in France. I mean, that changed at times, but more or less four. They were all based out of Paris, and they had what's called the booking office. Now, the booking office is a concept that came over from the United States back in the 1930s. So what that was is essentially, if you were a local promoter in some French town in the provinces, you wanted to do a wrestling show, but you don't have the talent, what do? You reach out to one of the four booking offices in Paris, you negotiate with them, you pay them a certain amount of money, they send you a show. When I say they send you a show, they tell you what the matches would be, who the wrestlers would be, but it obviously all depends on how much you're paying them. The more you pay, the bigger names you get.
There's also, if I'm not mistaken, who would also win as well a lot of the time.
Yeah, the booking office would determine that. Yeah. So the local promoter would just promote the show, and that's it. That was his job. So the point is, now these booking offices, that changed a lot over time, but sometimes they would work together. Sometimes there would be rivals. There were all sorts of twists and turns. Some of them quite interesting, actually, but they're a topic for another time. Now, the important thing to remember in terms of the TV is that in France, from 1949 until 1964, there was only one television network, and it was state-owned. So when the deal got worked out in the mid-50s for wrestling to air regularly on television, now in 54, the first stuff was just a few broadcasts per year, nothing regular. So a little bit later was when the regular stuff started. So when that happened, a deal got worked out with all four promoters, well, four promotions, I should say, for them to, at least the idea was that they would equally split the airtime. It didn't work out quite that way, so some of them were upset.
Of course not.
I mean, that's expected. It happens. They were alleging bribery and all sorts of stuff. I won't go into it. But anyway, so that's the unique thing about French TV. So from that point onward, the 50s, mid-50s, all the way until whenever French catch ended on TV, pretty much, the TV was never by one promotion, which, when you think about it, it's a pretty unique situation. The only similar thing I can think of that it's similar is in the UK in the 80s when All-Star Wrestling, WWF, and joint promotions were sharing the time slot for a little bit. But here it was years and years and years. Those four promotions, and again, keep in mind, they're not always working together. So it's a very unique thing, and kind of, angling for positions, who to get the best slots, who to get the most airtime. So there was a lot of drama involved in that.
When you talk about Pauli, I think, and Goldstein being the first TV broadcasters, reading the timeline of the two of them and all the controversial things that they sort of push forward in French wrestling, I'm not shocked that they were the first people to have a TV broadcasting some sort of system in play first. Yeah,
and that's controversial in quotes, just to clarify.
Yes, because if I recall, their controversial ideas were tag team wrestling and women's wrestling.
Exactly. Yeah.
Controversial indeed. Yeah, they're not doing like ECW Extreme Wrestling. They just want to have 4 people in a ring at once. By God. Anyways, yes. So and I guess to that extent, I guess the acknowledgement of like French catch wrestling is very much very conservative, I guess, in that sense, that it is very like it is one-on-one, it is 2 men going out and grappling until somebody gets pinned and wins. I assume it is I guess I actually think anything to say there. That's just what it was. It's very conservative. It's at some point I know that catch becomes legalized, I'll say, as a sport within France.
Yep, that's actually a good point. Thank you for bringing it up. It's good to explain as well. So you see, especially it was like that before in the 30s, but especially in the 40s when wrestling returned, it was very much set up as a sport and actually modeled after boxing. What I mean by that is that the French state essentially set up, because in France there are these federations, sports federations that deal with various different sports, like the football federation, the boxing federation, etc. So what they did after the war, they being the government, they put the French Wrestling Federation, that is the French Amateur Wrestling Federation, in charge of professional wrestling, and they created a group within it, a professional group of about 10 people that would more or less govern and rule all of professional wrestling in France. And by doing that, they said, professional wrestling, we recognize it as a sport, which the government had never really said. So now that wrestling had a federal status, a sports status, it was very much, everything was regulated, everything was within the rules. It was kind of traditional. They didn't, because basically the way it was is that anyone would try to do anything outside the rules, they would get their license pulled. So it was very difficult to be innovative in that sense. Although here I'll fast forward a bit. Eventually what happened, there was a bunch of drama, we won't get into it, but eventually the Amateur Federation dissociated itself with professional wrestling. And then more or less around the same time, different federations, in other words, different governing bodies started appearing. So things became a lot less regulated, and over time, even more so. But essentially, this is where it all started on a sports basis.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about, just because this came up in a question came up for me in my questioning. So we go and talk about these booking hall offices, right? They're sort of, they kind of work like hiring halls to a certain degree of a promoter which we should also say, promoters kind of run their own thing. They generally own their own stadiums. Sometimes maybe not stadiums, but arenas, you know what I mean?
Some do, some don't.
Some shared, obviously, especially when Paulo and Goldstein got connected. But when promoters would purchase a show, right? Did they have decision making in which stars they get to do? Obviously, the more money they're able to get bigger stars or get whatever. But do they have that much of a say in which stars they go to, which wrestlers they're able to pick up for their shows?
Well, I can't say for certain, because all I can tell you is this. I have seen, this was in the 60s, I have an actual breakdown that a promoter sent to a local promoter. It basically gives them a breakdown. If you want a show with 5 male matches, it's this is the price. If you want a show with 3 male matches and 2 female matches, this is the price. So that was the general kind of breakdown. From there, I would assume you could negotiate who is on the card. Actually, as a matter of fact, I know you could negotiate, but that may have ended up affecting your overall price.
Which would make sense. I remember seeing somewhere that specifically when it gets to, we talk about Leduc, there was something about how this is from Claude Roca. That's the American. Roca is probably a former wrestler as well. He talked about how Leduc had a massive salary. In a quote from him, his average salary was around 200 francs. Gilbert could earn anywhere between 5,000 to 8,000. So I imagine, look, if you want to get Leduc on your show, you need to fork over some more francs to get him onto your show.
Yeah, but the thing is, keep in mind, the local promoter didn't directly pay the wrestlers. They paid the booking office, then the booking office paid the wrestlers, however they felt, essentially. So it is possible the booking office may, skim some of the top. So that's also a possibility.
That is a whole other thing that we have to.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume happened just because. Yeah. But I guess no matter what, for the booking hall, skimp on the top. I imagine, generally speaking, they would take a percentage overall from the thing to keep the hall running. The sort of administrative fees.
Yeah.
Did they take more than the administrative fees? We're not going to touch it. We're not going to touch that. But it is wrestling, so
yeah. ...
I was trying to think if there's any other bits. Another important thing we should talk about: the seasonalness that is French catch wrestling territory. Right? It is, as far as I saw in the research online, typically there are more amount of shows in this sort of September, October to May, sort of going from the fall, winter into spring region. When it gets to summer, there are still shows, but it gets significantly lowered, more sporadic. But it's mostly a fall, winter, spring, school year-esque run territory, I guess you could say, than a 24/7 year-round sort of thing.
That is correct, especially for Paris. I'll put it to you like this. In Paris, at the peak of it, they were doing, during the season, I should say, about 8-9 shows per week in the city itself. If you include the suburbs, you're probably talking 15 shows a week, which is a lot. But then in the summer, it would go down to maybe, I'm not sure exactly, but maybe 2-3 at the most. But in the summer, they were, while not super active, there was a bit of a schedule going on, especially in the later years when they started doing like big top tours with like a circus top. But anyway, in the summer, they would do open air shows. So in the provinces, there was still a decent schedule going on, but not as active as during the season. Although in that case, that worked well for them, I should say, because some other territories like Spain, Greece, etc., were very active in the summer, so they could go there and get those paydays instead.
Oh, that's very nice in the summer, going down south towards the equator, just to work in even hotter buildings and even hotter outdoor venues. How nice and tropical. Anyways, that's my own issues of being outside. Do you have anything more to say about French catch as well? There is a conversation we had about the arenas specifically and the size of them, but I feel like we should kind of sort of put a pin in that, save that for the drawing power conversation later. I'm trying to think if I had any of the questions about French catch history. Well, I guess a big important thing we should also talk about it is your process in discovering this history. Like I said, that's sort of the top. You're a wrestling historian, but you're kind of the guy that, if you're finding French catch history research done online, it's typically written by Phil Lyons, right? So what is the research ability or sort of the difficulty sometimes when it comes to researching French catch, and why it is probably, just generally speaking, I think a lot of difficulty for especially like French wrestlers in the Hall of Fame? Why is it sort of a difficult area to research for a lot of people, and why is it so easy for you, Phil?
I wouldn't say easy. It's quite time consuming, but thank you for assuming, though.
No worries.
Well, first let me start off by saying this. In France, and not just France, I know Austria is the same, and other places, there is a rule, copyright rule, where in order for them to be able to make a newspaper scanned online and release it publicly, 70 years since the date of publication need to have passed. In other words, right now,
there are 70 years?
70 years indeed. So that means that right now we're only up to 1954. And then in January of next year, all of a sudden they'll release hundreds of newspapers all at once for 1955.
And is that your version of Christmas?
Pretty much, yeah. It's quite great. It's also overwhelming at the same time because they're literally hundreds and hundreds.
I'm sure. I'm very sure.
But it's all free, so that's the good part, at least. You don't have to pay for it, like let's say you would for newspapers.com, the US equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. Yeah.
So I guess the only way to get sort of around that is if you have physical copies, let's say, and if anyone else sort of wrote down information outside of newspapers, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And there are a few that are available past that point. And actually, as a matter of fact, there were a couple that they had randomly made available all the way until the 80s, but then they removed them. So I managed to pull up some info from there a few years back. But the other major source is there was a guy by the name of Michel Bézy, who was a French. I mean, he started off as a fan, but eventually he became a historian, you could say. As a matter of fact, I would go ahead and say that he was the top French wrestling historian of the 60s, 70s, up to the 80s. Mm-hmm. And he was also in the business as a promoter, ring announcer. He had a wrestling magazine. He was a correspondent for US magazines, like Wrestling Review, for example. So he did a lot. And this guy, he would collect results and he would email them to other historians, specifically a guy by the name of Gerhard Schaefer in Germany, who was one of the, if not the major German historian of the era. So they corresponded, sent each other results. So those archives are still around. And he also sent them letters that kind of reveal certain backstage happenings. So those have been very useful in digging through. And they are available, but not readily available. You need to know the right people. Or go to the institute where it has the collection of Gerhard Schaefer. So that's another kind of major source. Another thing to mention, I do have myself some magazines that I've gotten my hands on, either through buying or friends have sent me copies, like scanned copies, etc. So that's another big help. And finally, I do have to shout out Bob Plantin. Now, if you've watched French Catch or you've read about French Catch, that's likely a name you may have come across, even in passing. But Bob Plantin, I really have to give him credit because he's just incredible. This is a guy who's currently in his 80s. He used to be a wrestler back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. And this guy, every single day, and he's active mostly on Facebook, but he also does have a blog. Every single day he posts articles, results, posters from French Catch. Incredible amount of information and just incredible. How he does it at this age, I mean, kudos to him. But yeah, if you search through his stuff, you can find a lot. But it's just a little bit not in the right order. You have to sort it through, but it's incredible. I have to. And also, he's very helpful with questions as well. I mean, I've asked him so many questions over the years. He's not always the most forthcoming, if I'm being honest. Sometimes he keeps things a little bit kayfabe, but I'm not mad at it. He's been a great help as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of the history is not necessarily a slow drip of information, but it sounds like a sort of a scatter plot of details that you're sort of slowly kind of putting together. And then every year as more newspapers come out, you can get even more precise, let's say. So it sort of sounds like you have like a giant corkboard of various decades and years and trying to like slowly put together information, this full timeline of French catch history wrestling.
Exactly.
Well, then perfect. I think that's it in terms of that I can definitely think of in terms of French catch wrestling. There's a lot more, obviously, to talk about. There's a bunch of, you can Google and find a lot of Phil Lyons stuff. I'll probably you had at one point like a giant timeline of events from beginning to 1954, I'm guessing. So I'll probably put that in the link dump below for sure. But do you have any other things? I don't think I can think of any other French catch wrestling tidbits. Do you have any other big important things? Do you think that would be relevant for somebody like Leduc?
Not necessarily for Leduc, but I do have an article on L'Ange Blanc, the White Angel, Francisco Pino.
Yep.
Just do this. If you just Google Phil Lyons wrestling research, it would show up because I have like a topic where I've listed everything, and you can find whatever you're interested from there.
I'll put that in the linked up. I'll do that because I know that timeline piece that I just referenced. I know is a part of that whole thing.
Yeah, and there's a new update coming hopefully soon to that one.
Ooh, fingers crossed. Well, then great. Let's talk about Leduc. Obviously, he is the man we are discussing today on the program, on the ballot. So let's talk about him. I don't necessarily know when he was born, but I know that he started, I guess technically started as an amateur wrestler. He became a champion, and that was, I believe, pre-World War II. Then he went into the war, and then on the outside of the war, he sort of decided to start training and becoming a professional wrestler.
Mm-hmm. That is all correct. So just to give a quick summary of him and his career. So off the top of my head, I don't know the exact year of birth, but it was around 1925, around there, 25, 26, 24, around there. And he was born in the suburbs of Paris, although when he was about 7, his family moved into Paris. So he pretty much grew up in Paris. And then in the early 40s, he became interested in trying out boxing. So he went to a local, you could call it training facility to do that. But he ended up catching the eye of a guy by the name of Albert Arnaud. Now, Arnaud was a proficient amateur, but also a professional wrestler, French champion, French welterweight champion in the 30s, I believe, or middleweight, I think.
I believe it was welterweight.
Yeah, then he became middleweight European champion. But yeah, either way, it doesn't matter. So he caught his eye, and initially he was training him as an amateur. And what ended up happening, Leduc ended up becoming a champion on the university level. So if you will, like a US equivalent would be NCAA champion, something like that, in France, I believe in Greco-Roman style. Could be freestyle, I don't remember top of my head, but I think it's Greco-Roman. So then obviously this was right in the middle of the war. This is 43, 44, around there. Professional wrestling, remember, it's banned, so it's not even an option at this point in France. Then shortly, for a little bit, Leduc, who was maybe 17, 18, 19 at that time, he went into the army actually and fought in a little bit in World War II. And after the war ended, that's when he decided to turn professional. Arnaud trained him a little bit, and he joined one of the promotions at the time, which was, I mean, there is no official name to it. The French promotions didn't really have proper names like we would expect, like WWF, WCW until the 80s, but he joined what was essentially the Salle Wagram promotion, Wagram Hall, if you will, promotion, which at the time was being kind of booked, I should say, by a guy by the name of Paul Marton, who was like an influential behind-the-scenes guy, a Hungarian who lived in France for many years. So this was his start. And what's notable about his start is that if you look at the results very early on, you can even read the articles. Very early on, you can see that they saw potential in this guy. And if you look at his track record, a winning record, I should say, in Paris in particular, he was mostly winning his matches. He wasn't beating big names at first, but he was slowly kind of growing. And then eventually, what ended up happening, he won the French welterweight title, and then the European welterweight title, which actually is a good point to mention. Now, at this particular point in French pro wrestling history, remember what we discussed earlier, the Amateur Federation was ruling over all of professional wrestling, apart from some outlaw guys and promotions, but all of professional wrestling. So therefore, there was only one champion in the whole of France. So there's one European champion of that division, that weight class, one French, etc. There were no world titles yet introduced. So essentially, by winning the European welterweight title 2 years into his career, that made Leduc the top welterweight in the country, which 2 years into the business, that's, I would say, pretty good to begin with. Yeah. And so from there...
Well, and then you know, like you said, then winning the European welterweight championship, if I'm not mistaken, that I believe probably made him the first double champion.
That will be the world. That's a little bit later. So yeah, that's what happened. No, that's okay. You're right. You're right. We'll get to it. So that's the next part. So what happened is, in 1949, he jumped ship from the Salle Wagram promotion over to the Cirque de Hiver promotion, Cirque de Hiver being the arena where Alex Goldstein was promoting out of, so the Goldstein promotion, if you will. And that's where, because before, Leduc was climbing the card, and he did do a few main events in Paris, more so main events outside of Paris, but he wasn't a properly established headline star yet. He was the champion, but a welterweight, so it's one of the lower classes, obviously, so they didn't get to headline a lot at this point yet, or even in general, as a matter of fact. But anyway, so in 1949, he jumps to Goldstein, and by this point, he had lost both of those titles he had won before. He re-won them here, and what's more than that, a little bit later on, he ended up winning the world welterweight title, which they finally introduced, which made him two things. First of all, the first Frenchman to win a world championship in France. When I say world championship, I mean in the catch style. There were some Greco-Roman guys way back when. I'm not counting them here. So that was the first thing. And the second thing is he became the first guy to hold a European and a world championship at the same time. So that's a nice little accomplishment right there.
Oh yeah, that certainly adds to the historical significance case for him, I think.
Yeah. So by this point, for Goldstein is where really he became established as a top star. So I would say 49 going into 50, that's when you start to see him headlining more shows, or if he's not headlining, he's the semi-main. So he's pretty high up there. And also at this point, now that he was a European champion, eventually world champion, he actually started traveling more to other countries. When I say other countries, I mean the UK, Spain, eventually Belgium, Switzerland, even went over to Morocco and probably some other North African countries. So Germany a little bit. So he started traveling about, and pretty much everywhere he went, he was, depending on the stage of his career, obviously we'll talk about it in a moment, but he held different championships over time. But depending on the stage of his career, wherever he went, he was pretty much recognized as champion and did actually have some title defenses as well. And like, for example, in Morocco, of all places, you wouldn't expect the French title to be, I guess you would, because it was a French territory. Yeah, you would. But anyway, but the point is, he started traveling around and building his reputation. And here I'll say that Spain was his really main foreign country where he had a lot of success. He did all right in some other ones, but Spain was the place where he went a lot over the years, up until 1966 on and off, and where he was fairly highly regarded and where his titles were recognized and where he won titles, put local guys over to make them, etc., etc. So this is for now for the international aspect of his career. Then we get to 1954, where the controversial ideas start happening. And Paulie and Goldstein had been trying to introduce tag team wrestling specifically in France. They got shut down a couple of times. What I mean by that, the governing body, which by that point was kind of had switched over from the amateur federation to now a new professional federation. And there was a vote. Pretty much 90 to 100% of the people voted no tag team wrestling on a couple of occasions. So finally, Paulie and Goldstein were like, you know what, screw it. And they split off and they created their own federation and introduced tag team wrestling from there. Now, Leduc, however, being a bit of a traditionalist, did not go with them. Him and some other guys actually remained with their opposition. Now, when I say their opposition, what ended up happening actually is all the other three major French promotions united against Paulie for the controversial idea of tag team wrestling. So now Paulie was kind of the outsider, even though him and Goldstein were technically the biggest promotion, but it was technically 1 against 3, if you will.
And so, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just sort of saying that it's 1 against 3, but it's sort of, all these sort of separate groups are now sort of converging together. So it's kind of a one-on-one group of individual promoters kind of all fighting each other to a certain degree, or at the very least, these sort of governing bodies, I guess you could say, fighting each other.
Yeah, more or less, yeah. And the promoters themselves below the governing bodies. So yeah, Leduc worked for that group until 58, late 58. And then in 58, something interesting happened. Now, regrettably, at this stage, due to the whole 70-year rule thing, I don't have the full details, but something happened to where there was an interesting switch in allegiances. Now, Paulie and Goldstein had been the outsiders. Now, things changed, and Maurice Durand, which was the guy kind of in charge of the Salva Grand promotion, the original promotion where Leduc had started, he became the outsider. And I think this was all connected because in 1958, there was an alliance of European promoters created, which in the UK, they called it the European Wrestling Alliance. In France, it had a different name, which was technically the official name because it was a French alliance, but based out of France, I should say. But the point is, what happened is, those three promoters, the three promoters from France, the three promotions, along with joint promotions in the UK, which were the main group there, along with some German promoters, Spain, Belgium, Italy, they all created an alliance similar to the NWA, you could say, although not as official. I think mostly it was about shedding talent more than anything. It didn't really do much in the long scheme of things. But what ended up happening around this time, that's when Durand got kicked to the curb. I think he was originally supposed to be part of it, but something happened. There were disputes. He got kicked to the curb. This is where perhaps the animosity between him and Goldstein started, because they had a lot of animosity later on. But either way, he was the outsider now. And Leduc, actually, and again, I don't know the full details, but Leduc went with Duran. And the interesting thing is that now, for the first time in his career, Leduc was essentially in the opposition, because before he could always been in the larger kind of group. And it was an interesting position. We'll talk about when we get to the influence part. There's something interesting to discuss here, but we'll leave it for later, no spoilers. And from there, he worked for Durant, with Durant, I should say, for pretty much the next 10 plus years, until eventually that promotion more or less closed shop. And then in the early 70s, 72, I believe, he went back to the Goldstein promotion, which at that point really was the René Benchimol promotion, another wrestler. But anyway, and from there, he stayed on with this promotion. Mm-hmm. That promotion eventually went out of business as well. So he went over to the last bastion of hope for French catch, which was the Roger Delaporte promotion, and worked for that promotion until, I would say, around 1982 when he retired.
I just real quickly want to say, you said outsiders, and I immediately thought of two Frenchmen in all jean jacket attire coming in out of nowhere. And then apparently you talk about Maurice Duran, which to me became new knowledge. And then, he became an outsider. I was like, oh, he's the third man. Anyways, that was my bits. That's fascinating. I didn't know about all the 60 stuff. And obviously you'll learn more as the decade goes on with newspaper stuff, but that's fascinating. You talked about how, just for clarity's sake, I think you talked about how Leduc sort of was working for this promotion, and then he would switch to this other one, and then then he would eventually become part of this sort of outsider competition, group. Just for clarity's sake, when you say that he is switching from promotion to promotion and working for one specific promotion, as we said earlier, these are promoters that would essentially purchase cards and purchase wrestlers. I guess that sounds like more like promoters would choose specific wrestlers, or maybe it might perhaps sound like wrestlers would maybe perhaps say no or say yes to specific promoters, even without a specific contract that like we would kind of have in a modern sense, right? Is that sort of the case? Was it just sort of like the wrestlers had their preference on promoter, and then just when things shook out, it was just sort of like, all of a sudden I'm now working for the outsider promotion without these sort of mainline contracts?
Mm-hmm. Well, a few things to unpack here. Now, first, when I say promotion, I really mean booking office. Just to kind of make it clear. Okay, perfect. So, and the way these booking offices work generally, they would have a number of wrestlers affiliated with them, exclusively to them in general.
Yes.
Now, obviously, if two booking offices work together, they would share the talent, but generally, you would have your booking office that you're affiliated with. There weren't necessarily contracts in general. That said, some guys did have contracts. It wasn't common, but some did. Usually like the bigger stars, I would say. And when I say contracts, I mean, quick side note, there was a guy by the name of Robert Charon who was a popular boxer, switched over to wrestling. And then when he ended up jumping ship from one promotion to another, there was a whole lawsuit about it over breach of contract. So that's where you can find a lot of neat little details. Like, for example, and this is in 53, 54, around there, 52 even maybe. Details like he had almost a 3-year contract. He had a downside guarantee where he would be paid 100,000 francs per month, no matter what. So these sorts of things existed. Not predominant, but did exist. Another point to make here, though, so you would have these wrestlers that are affiliated with a specific office, exclusive to that office, but you also did have independents. Yes. Meaning, now Bob Plantin, the guy that I mentioned earlier, the guy in his 80s, he was, for the most of his career, an independent, meaning he would work for all of the booking offices, whoever would book him.
Okay. Interesting. I appreciate the clarity because I think that's important. That's part of the clarity for all of this is what all this means. And I assume that means Leduc never really had a contract with anybody, right? He was not, I guess, a big enough star for that.
I mean, he was a big star, so I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. Actually, another quick thing to mention here in terms of the opposition thing. He was in the opposition group, although then in 1961, some things happened. And again, realignment happened. And all of a sudden, it was 2-on-2. It wasn't now 3-on-1. It was 2-on-2. It stayed like that for a while. So then at that point, you could say he was no longer the opposition. It was just like an equal 50-50 type of thing. But yeah, essentially, that's it.
Perfect. I'm learning so much. I'm just gonna I said it to you, Phil, offline, that like I did a bunch of research, but like ultimately this episode is going to be me learning a bunch of stuff as well, because this is fascinating. Hearing about all this sort of stuff is fascinating to me, truly. So I guess I'll play the audience surrogate this episode. That's fantastic. Well, but yeah, so then I think to close out Leduc, he wrestles throughout all of that, and I believe he retires wrestling around 82, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, correct.
He, career babyface, perennial champion as well. Successful as singles, and of course did some tag team wrestling, the controversial tag team wrestling. That's what I remembered. Championships. How did they work in France? Obviously in a lot of different territories, I mean, still even today, titles don't mean as much, let's say. How important were titles in terms of star power or drawing power or any of these sort of things in showcasing, who mattered in the territory? How important were titles in France, and I guess to a certain degree, European and world titles?
Well, they were, but not as much as, let's say, titles are today in the American promotions. They were important. They signified who was either up and coming, if it was a French champion, or the top guy if it was a world champion. But it wasn't the promotions, the booking. It wasn't built around the titles. As a matter of fact, initially, when the Amateur Federation was still ruling over all of professional wrestling, and there were only, really, just to throw this out there, at this point they had 5 weight classes, and they only had French, European, and world champions. So you're talking 15 titles for all of France, all promotions. So think about that, an entire industry, only 15 titles. Later that changed, obviously, with new federations, but
the internet would complain so much less about that.
Yeah, right. And these titles, because of that, they weren't promotion exclusive. They were valid for all promotions at the time. So they were important, but actually, I forgot what I was saying. So I was saying, when it was still the FFL, which was the Amateur Wrestling Federation, they actually even had a rule that titles can only be defended so many times per season in Paris specifically. I think it was 3 times or 4 times. You couldn't, like, specific title, you couldn't defend the world title in a division more than 3-4 times for the year. That was it. So they didn't want to overdo it, essentially. They wanted to keep it meaningful, because usually the title matches were used as something to draw, because they weren't as regular. So that's what they were using for, really. So in a way, you could say they were props, like titles usually are, but they weren't like super, super important in the grand scheme of things.
Interesting. That's interesting. I didn't really I didn't know that there was. I guess that makes sense if they're the booking office as well and making the results, that they wanted to keep the titles important and had a limit on how often the titles were defended. That's interesting.
Yeah, and you want to know something crazy about titles? It gets even crazier. Now, and this next thing I'm about to say, it's not something I'm assuming based on my research. It's something that I've heard said on national television by one of the French promoters, while the other 3 were sitting right next to him. So this is all from his mouth.
Okay.
Now, eventually, as we said at the beginning, it was just one federation, one governing body, so you only had so many titles. Then eventually there were 2, then 3 major governing bodies. So technically, and also by that point, there was another weight class. So technically, each governing body could have 18 titles if you wanted to. 6 divisions, 3 titles, etc. However, the interesting thing is, and this is true for Leduc and a couple of other guys, and this is coming straight from Maurice Durand, his boss at the time.
Yep.
Eventually, Leduc became the world light heavyweight champion. And you would think, when Durant is the opposition to all the others, and they're in a bitter promotional war, that the other guys would end up crowning their own world light heavyweight champion to kind of discredit his stars. But no, they would not. Because certain guys, like, I'll tell you exactly what Durant said. The other again, this is kind of in kayfabe, you could say, but still, he said the other promoters know that Leduc is the best in that class. They wouldn't dare. It just doesn't make sense to them to crown a new champion. And think about how crazy that is. Imagine today, for example, Tony Storm was the AEW Women's World Champion, and WWE and TNA would refuse to crown a women's champion just because of how much respect they have for Tony Storm. It sounds crazy, but they did it with Leduc and a couple of other guys as well. I should say, by the way, for the majority of his run as world champion, because he was champion for 20 years. So things changed a little bit, but essentially, that's how it worked.
That's crazy. That's so. Well, you also have to remember, like, keep in mind is that, like, he has worked with other these promoters. He's obviously worked with Goldstein for a while as well. So it's like, so obviously there's the element of kayfabe, but there is probably some regard of that being accurate and true, that like Goldstein probably was like, well, no, I'm just gonna, we're all just going to sort of see Leduc as the world light heavyweight champion, like that being a shoot, if you will.
Yeah, I think they felt that if they tried to introduce someone else, the fans wouldn't buy it.
Which I mean, that's speaks so highly of Leduc, I think. Which, I don't know which topic to get into first, but sort of that, I mean, I kind of feel like it leads to historical significance for Leduc, is that the fact that, well, one, he is champion countless times and at one point champion for 20 plus years is crazy. But then to be so respected and loved by, obviously the promoters, but presumably obviously the fans as well, that being a big part of things. If the fans rejected Leduc, I imagine the other promoters wouldn't necessarily have an issue with crowning their own world light heavyweight champion. But the fact that everyone all agrees that, like, we could have our own champion, but no, Leduc's the guy, that really speaks how highly everyone sees Leduc.
Yeah, and even when they were rivals, like at the height of their rivalry in the late 50s, it's crazy. The one thing they agree on is Leduc's the guy. That is that's crazy. That is so cool. That is so cool to learn. And meanwhile, one guy is suing the other in court over something else. That is legitimately really cool to learn. That is fascinating. Well, by the way, one quick thing to note, just to kind of tie it all together. Now, when we say the 20-year run, technically, I've confirmed actually recently, he held it from, this being the world light heavyweight title, he held it from about 1955 until 1963. He dropped it for a few months and then picked it up again and held it until 74. So when you put it all together, obviously almost 20 years, but those reigns are across different promotions. When he would jump from promotion to promotion, he would continue being recognized as the champion, just to tie it all together.
And then he would have the title for sort of short reigns following that in 75 and 76, 77 as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, from the looks of it, although those years are a little bit difficult to confirm. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll find those out in, what is it, the 70s? So we'll find that out in 20 years.
Approximately,
or maybe we'll get some other information some other way. But let's start talking about the breakdown of Leduc when it comes to the Hall of Fame. Of course, this is the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. There are sort of three big criteria points that everyone sort of agrees on that David set out there. That is working ability, not necessarily work rate in the ring. This could also be promos and whatnot. But obviously work rate in the ring being a massively big one. Drawing power and historical significance in a positive manner. When we talk about historical significance, obviously there's the positive to negative conversation, but there's also the sort of influential things. I was talking with Adam Berger, previous guest on the ballot. We started talking about how, influential wrestlers can exist and be very popular for a number of years, or perhaps have matches that are very important as well. But it's sort of the ripple effects beyond that. I talked about on the show previously how there's sort of the canon of pro wrestling. When you talk about the best in France, the Mount Rushmore, if you will, of France, who's going to be on that list, let's say? Who's the best of France in the 50s or whatever, just pull that out of my butt. But this sort of conversation, but it's not just that, it is also the ripple effects of these things and those influences. And I know, Phil, that you have a lot to say about the influence of Leduc on French wrestling.
Now, as far as influence, I like to break it down into two parts. You have significance and then influence, which are not necessarily the same thing. They're all connected, but not necessarily the same thing. So I'll start with the significance aspect. I mean, the two major things here are that if you look at the television era in France, and I started at 54 when started airing live on TV. That's from 54 to 85. If you look at that era, I mean, there is no question about it. Leduc is top 10 in terms of significance in the history of the country. No matter what way you look at it, top 10. Likely top 5, but then it gets a little bit trickier. How do you exactly measure it? Different criteria, but definitely top 10. So that in itself, because again, remember, in that era, France is one of the top European territories, without a doubt. It's also one of the only 2 European territories with TV, the other being the UK, which is also an important thing in itself because it gave wrestling a whole new mainstream attention that it cannot get otherwise. Well, it's difficult to get otherwise. So in that sense, being a top star in a top territory for so long, and that's another point, actually, speaking of being a top star. So he was a top star from around 49, now do the math, all the way to almost the end of his career, I would say until the mid-70s. So you're looking at almost
20, 30, 20, 25 years?
Yeah, that's pretty significant. And when I say top star, I mean consistently in headline matches. I mean, sometimes semi-main, but that's more or less still there. So that's pretty significant. And I mean, there's not a ton of French guys you could say that about, because obviously not all of them, even to begin with, had such long careers. But the fact that he did, it's quite impressive in that sense. And on top of that, he was a top star in places like Spain as well. So he's got that. Actually, I would go as far as to say that in Spain, he has a strong case for being either the first or second, how do I put it, not biggest, but most consistent foreign star in the history of Spain, I would say. The other one being a guy by the name of Stan Caroli, but he's another topic for another day. So in that sense, he's very significant. And also, if you want to look at it like that, again, because of longevity, but also because of him just being him, he's one of the guys who had the most matches aired on television over the years. Some guys wrestled for years and years and years, but wouldn't get TV matches. They just weren't that important, wouldn't get featured, whereas he would get featured. Now, currently, we do have only about 23 of his matches in terms of video, but he definitely had more than that. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but definitely more than that, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when you consider that French TV wasn't weekly for the most part, and that it was 4 different promotions, and that there were times where it got taken off TV for different reasons. So 23, it may not sound like a lot, but compared to the other guys, it's a lot. Well, and again, it's more than 23 anyway.
It sounds like sort of the cream of the crop would get the television time. And the fact that Leduc would have 20 plus years, obviously longevity is the discussion point as well for Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. The fact that he would be a top star for 20 plus years, have all this TV time, is, again, really speaks to how loved and how loved he was in France.
That's the other thing. Speaking of loved, early on in his career, I would say early 50s, so maybe 5 years in, not so early, but still early, he became known as Chouchou. Now, Chouchou, that's a funny sounding word, but Chouchou literally means pet, but what it actually means is favorite. So he became known as the people's favorite, the people's champion, if you will.
The Rock, the people's pet, of course.
Pretty much. So that was his kind of nickname throughout. And later he also had the Gentleman of the Ring. So that's the other thing. And actually, early on, it's not a good point to bring. Early on, they were trying to get him over as, this was really early on in his career, they were trying to get him over as the Carpentier of wrestling. Now, Carpentier, it's not Edward Carpentier. It's Georges Carpentier, who was one of the most famous French boxers, like a good-looking French boxer. So they were trying to kind of do that, but ultimately it didn't stick. They went with, well, the crowd gave him more or less the nickname Chouchou. So, he was a beloved.
You go with what works. You go with the crowd wants.
Exactly.
So I mean, obviously, another big part of his sort of historical significant case. We'll talk about this more when it comes to work rate. But he was not just a really great wrestler, but seen as a great wrestler, obviously, for a very long time. And being a sort of top wrestler in that region certainly adds into that Hall of Fame historical significance case, I would say.
Yeah, and then there's the influence part of it as well.
Yes.
Now, as far as influence as a wrestler, I don't know that he had a lot of influence. I mean, he was great. He was there for a long time. I'm sure he influenced his colleagues in some ways, trained with them a little bit, but he didn't necessarily exclusively train any wrestlers or do anything in the ring that would end up changing the business in any way. I don't think.
I don't recall anyone else in the history of professional wrestling spinning like a top.
That's a thing. Yeah. Interesting. Although I'd have to look at the footage. It's possible because the thing with the French footage is you think you've seen everything, and then you see some move that it's like, what? They did this in the 40s? What?
That is fair. It is fair.
Yeah, so maybe someone else did it, but yeah, he's the one who popularized it. In French, they were calling it 2P. That was the name of it. And yeah, the spinning top where he would spin on his head and either take down his opponent with his legs crossed like Eurico del Santo does, or just escape. But yeah, he did that. And it was very imitated, that move, but he did it best, obviously.
So it was imitated by people? You do know that?
Later on, it was, yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, that adds to it something as well. Well, then what was we talked about him as influence as a wrestler, or lack thereof? What was his influence behind the scenes?
Now, here's where it gets interesting. First, I'll start off by saying, actually, no, I'll leave it for next. So, Leduc, in terms of influence, he was most influential, although it's difficult to gauge his influence because of the next thing I'm about to say, but he was actually also one of the top bookers in French pro wrestling for a decent amount of time. So he became an organizer, and this is what I have to explain. Now, in French, they have this term, organizer, which makes things so difficult to figure out. So organizer is essentially, they would call this essentially everyone who in any way organized the show. Now, what does this mean? It means this could be the promoter because he's technically putting on the show, he's organizing it. This could also be the matchmaker, in other words, the booker. So he's also an organizer. Then it could be the guy running the booking office who's negotiating the rates, which may not be the same as the promoter or the booker, maybe a different guy. So that's also an organizer. So all of a sudden you end up with all these organizers. Perfect example, the Durand promotion Leduc was working for later. Maurice Durand was technically an organizer. Leduc was an organizer, and there was a guy by the name of Jean Denebehe. He was an organizer. So all of a sudden, there are three organizers, and you read it and you go, "Well, who did what?" so it's a little bit difficult to say, but I can say this: Leduc became an organizer while working for Goldstein in the early to kind of mid 50s. So that's very early in his career, which says something as well. I mean, to become an organizer for one of the top booking offices, like 6 or 7 years into his career, whatever it was, that says something right there. But more importantly, I know he was the organizer during the time when him and Durand were the opposition group, which that time, the late 50s, early 60s, was actually the very peak of French pro wrestling in terms of popularity. So he was essentially one of the bookers during the peak of it. And his promotion, well, an opposition promotion, I mean, still did well. It wasn't struggling for money or exposure. It still did well. I cannot say whether it was ultimately number 3, 4, 5, or sorry, 2, 3, 4. Those are the options. Difficult to say. Definitely was a number 1, but it was up there. So he was the booker, and I say the booker because from what I can tell, Durand was ultimately the boss, the head guy, and some of the booking came from him, but the day-to-day stuff, I'll give you the exact quote by Bob Plantin when I asked him about this. He told me, Leduc regulated the wrestlers, was the exact quote. In other words, everything, all the orders came down from him, more or less. So he was, in that sense, he was booking. Obviously, it's difficult to say how much of the booking was him, how much the booking was Durand, but he was definitely in the mix. And Bob told me this would have been in the late 50s, early 60s, so maybe 61, 62. Then I don't know if he continued booking in between, but I do know that in 65, 66, 67, him and one of his tag team partners, Claude Montorsi, were actually, again, the bookers. And again, I don't know if it was all throughout or they had a break in the middle, but the point is, for a good amount of time, he was one of the bookers of French pro wrestling, one of the top companies. So in that sense, he had influence, meaning he helped create new stars, and actually so ties back to his kind of work. Now, he may have been the booker, but from what I can tell at least, he wasn't a selfish booker. Perfect example of this. Right as they became the opposition group, at the beginning they were struggling a bit for stars. They needed stars because most of the guys remained with the bigger group, the other 3 promotions, I should say. So they wanted to make a star and they wanted to make a star quickly. So they introduced a new masked character, which was actually a copy of Goldstein character, but it doesn't matter anyway. So they introduced a guy by the name of, that's the gimmick they gave him. It was called Le Bourreau de Bethune, the executioner of Bethune, who was this wrestler Jacques Ducret. And they debuted him on TV against Leduc, and Leduc did a brilliant job for him. Essentially, the finish was a gutbuster. Well, he had worked on Leduc's stomach throughout the match. Then he did a big gutbuster, and Leduc saw the stomach as if something had ruptured in him. And then they did a big not a stretcher job, but they carried him out. And apparently afterwards, because there had never been a finish like that on French television to that extent, like a proper, not a stretcher job, but carry job, if you will, after the match. And afterwards, apparently there were hundreds of calls to the network asking about Leduc's condition. So it was a big deal. And that guy straight away got over huge and became probably the top heel in all of France. And that was all Leduc. Obviously, he's the booker. He could say, I'll put someone else in the spot. I'm not doing the job. But he put himself in that spot to make that guy. So that says something to me.
That sounds to me, I'm a big fan of Big Van Vader. And that sounds very Big Van Vader debut on Inoki. I don't know how long the match was for sure, but obviously, basically destroying the top dog and then the crowd. Well, I don't know. I doubt Parisians necessarily threw flaming cushions into the ring, but it sounds like it greatly upset them in a different Parisian style.
Yeah. So that was, I would say, so most of his influence would have been behind the scenes in that aspect. But again, it's difficult to say what exactly he did and how much of it, but he definitely was influential, helped make some guys. And actually, going back to the significance part, just to mention another thing here. Now, he was a top star for a long time, but generally he was never the top star of the top promotion. I'll say it like this.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a drawback to him. But then again, he started as welterweight, then moved up to middleweight, then light heavyweight. In general, the very top stars back then were heavyweights. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it was even possible for him to be the top star. I mean, he was the top star of his promotion. He was the top star of the division, but not the top star in France as a whole. Those were usually the heavyweight guys. So that is another important aspect to clarify.
I do like learning about him time as a booker from 50s, 60s, potentially into the 70s, it sounds like. Because it is fascinating, because it is exactly when his 20-year-esque reign of his world light heavyweight championship starts. And I'm just thinking to myself, I was like, oh, well, he is the booker. And then, but then not just that, but then, as you know, to tie like all the things that we're talking about here, is that like he is champion, that he is the booker of Duran's promotion while he is champion. And then at the same time, and I don't know if that plays into him being a booker / organizer, he is so well respected by all the other promotions that they allow him to just be world light heavyweight champion. And maybe it is because like he is well respected and he has good influence, and maybe there's wrestlers outside of or I don't know. Like I said, they don't have like contracts or whatever, and it is sort of split off into these various factions, let's say, of promotions. But I wonder if there was also this sort of thing of like, well, if we want to work with that booking hall office, we can't upset the guy in charge. So we'll and we also respect him and like him, so we'll just sort of allow the world light heavyweight champion to be him. Yeah. I wonder if that plays into it at all.
Yeah, and I'll say two things here. First of all, I've never, granted, I don't obviously have the opinions of everyone, but I've never seen anyone ever complain in terms of the wrestlers, oh, why is this guy the champion? Yeah. He's the booker, that's why. He's never seen that. Actually, they all speak with, all the ones that I've seen anyway, all speak about him with very, very high respect. So that's the first thing. Second of all, now, when he won the world title, this was during the phase where it was Goldstein and Pauli versus the other three promotions. So even if he was the booker at that time for one promotion, there were still the other two that were all working together. So I'm guessing he would have needed to run it by all three. He couldn't single-handedly say, I'm the champion now. So, and I don't know whether he was booking at that time specifically. That's the gap that I don't know. I know he was booking for Goldstein. I don't know, later he was booking for Duran, but I don't know in between that period from like 55 to 58, middle 58. That I don't know.
But we'll certainly figure that out. But I mean, nonetheless, being an organizer, a booker of sort of a peak wrestling period as well, even if it's not for the top promotion, that definitely speaks volumes, I think.
Yeah, it does.
Let's move on and talk about the drawing power. I think this, the sort of the middle section here, I think it's fair to say, as we sort of kind of already alluded to several times in the show, not necessarily his strongest thing. He is top champion. He becomes, the world welterweight champion, the world light heavyweight champion multiple time. He becomes, to a certain degree, right, a draw in other countries like in Spain. But and he also being a top guy, but not necessarily of the number one promotion. So there is this stuff where he is, I think it's fair to say, a very good draw, but it doesn't necessarily come across that he's a bona fide Hall of Fame draw. Is that sort of fair to say?
It is, and it isn't. I'll explain what I mean. It probably is. I think probably, if I were to guess here, and I'll explain in a second what I mean by guess and why I'm guessing. If I were to guess, I would say good to very good, but not exceptional, probably overall. The reason being, well, for two reasons. First of all, I mean, you don't stay on top for so long if you're not at least good, even if you're the booker for some of it. I mean, otherwise business would die. You don't stay on top for 20 years. So that tells me right there that he was putting butts in seats in France and in other places as well, because in Spain he had a long run as well. So that's the first thing. Now, second of all, like you alluded to, the French territory, the way it was set up, it was kind of similar to the UK in that they were running a lot of shows, but they were running small to mid-sized venues. So you wouldn't get like you would get in places like in Mexico or the United States, regular shows at 10,000 seat venues, 20,000. That just wasn't it. Now, that said, and actually I just should clarify now, in Paris specifically, the venues they were running regularly were between 1,000 to about 3,500.
Yes,
in the provinces,
there was one bigger arena with 18,000, I believe, but that not burned down, but torn down from fire damage in 1959.
Yeah, that's part of my next point. I'll get to it exactly. But before that, I wanted to mention that. So those were the kind of the venues, 1,000 to about 3,500. Leduc worked in Salvagram mostly, obviously. For Durant, it was about 2,500 or 2,600 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But now in the French provinces, there were some like bigger venues, like maybe 4, 5, 6. And then in the summer, they would run certain open air kind of bull rings and stadiums that could be bigger, not regularly, but they would. Now, the arena you alluded to, Palais des Sports, it was called. This is the venue that Pauli was based out of. And he ran it from 33 all the way to 59 when it got damaged by a fire and demolished. It was for 18,000. He would run it typically every other week, obviously minus the war years. And the thing is, though, even though Pauli and Goldstein became partners in 52, they still kept their businesses somewhat separate. Goldstein would have his stars that he would focus on, and Pauli would have his stars that he would focus on. The reason for that is because the Pauli shows, Palais des Sports, were heavyweight based. It was mostly heavyweights, always heavyweights on top. So Leduc only worked a handful of matches at that big venue. That said, here's a notable thing that maybe adds a little bit to his credibility as a draw. As far as I can recall, he's the only, well, he was first a welterweight, then a middleweight, but he's the only welterweight and middleweight to have headlined, or not headlined, sorry, I should say semi-main evented a Palais des Sports show in that 18,000 seat arena. I don't think anyone else did it, and he did it for 2 championship matches, both of which he lost, but either way, he headlined. I think he lost both, actually. Yeah. So there's that. Now,
semi-main evented for a predominantly heavyweight promotion.
Exactly. That's a good point. That's it, exactly, which pretty much nobody else did as far as I can recall. Or maybe if someone did it, it was just a one-off, and it wasn't like a major match, like a championship match. But I'm pretty sure no one else did. I have to check my notes, but I'm pretty sure. So that's some credibility. Now, the other aspect of his drawing power, and this is not a aspect that concerns just him, it concerns every single candidate of Europe ever, especially once after a certain period of time, and that is the aspect that there's just no data. That's the issue with Europe.
Yes. That's my next question and thing I was going to ask you about. Go ahead.
Yeah. And this is the biggest drawback with him. I mean, I can assume he was a big draw or good draw or very good draw, whatever the case, but
the longevity would suggest that there is a drawing aspect.
Yeah. Yeah. But I cannot prove it in any way. It's just my guess versus yours.
Yeah, because there's a bunch of cards that we have out there, and I saw a bunch of them. I saw a bunch of your write-ups for these cards. Don't see any attendances data to any of those things. Now, like we said, it maxes out, like, typically when he worked in with in the Saul Wagram, 2,600 seats, and maxes out there, but like we don't even have the attendance data for those sort of smaller shows, let's say.
Yeah. And the thing with the lack of data, in general, the European press back then wasn't as number-minded as the North American press. So while you would get show reports, they wouldn't comment on the attendance. They normally wouldn't even do like a guesstimate. They would, let alone a number.
Do you, I mean, this is just me theorizing, but do you think that is perhaps that maybe they would just typically be full? Like, I don't know if this is just me theorizing, but maybe like they didn't put out the number because it was just filled up, and why would I report the same number over and over again?
It's possible.
But
at the end of the day, though, it's the journalist's call to at least offer an estimate if they wanted to, but they didn't. Now, here is the question. Now, how connected was that particular journalist to the promoter? Maybe the promoter didn't want to get it out. Whatever the case it was, but in general, and this is not a French problem, this is all across Europe. Numbers are very hard to come by.
Yes.
And here's the bigger point here. Let's take out Leduc out of the equation for a moment. If we had access, like people have this idea of Europe, mostly because most people only know, when they think of European wrestling, they think UK World of the Sport or Otto Vance CWA. That's most people's perception because those are the two most recent ones. That's all people know. Well, those two businesses normally focused on smaller to mid-sized venues and a lot of shows. They didn't necessarily run big venues. I mean, Otto did some, but not a ton. And so because of this, I think people have this perception of Europe that historically Europe has never been a place where promoters, I should say, run big venues, which couldn't be further from the truth. I'll throw out some venues and just to give you an idea of what I mean here. Now, in France, obviously, we had the venue that we mentioned, Palais des Sports, 18,000 seats from 33 to 59. That's a lot of years, every other week. We also had the bull rings in Marseille and Bordeaux that they would run. Those are 10,000. We also had the amphitheater of Nimes, which is about 15,000 that they would run in the summer sometimes. Switch over to Belgium. In Antwerp, in Belgium, there was the Sport Palais, 18,000. They ran it for over 40 years, 40 that is. Mm-hmm. Then we have over in Switzerland, there's, what's the name of it? Let me see, I have it somewhere in my notes. Hallen Stadion, I think it was something like that. That was about 11, 12 or up to 15, depending on the configuration. Then let's go over to Greece, where every summer they would run for like 30 years, let's say. They would run multiple stadium shows, sometimes 5-6 stadium shows per week. When I say stadium shows, I mean 10, 15, 20,000 seaters. Let's go over to Spain, or actually before Spain, let's go over to Vienna in Austria. Heumarkt, a lot of shows there. That was for 10,000. Spain. Now in Spain, from the late 40s all the way to the 70s, every summer, pretty much every notable Spanish city in the summer would have wrestling at their local bull ring or stadium. And even some of the smaller ones. So this could be anywhere from 7,000, 8,000 all the way to 20-something thousand. So when you put it all together, now imagine if we had the numbers for all of those, and there are more, but I'm just giving you a few examples. If we had the numbers for all of those, I mean, our perception, our idea of who the biggest draws were would change drastically. And obviously, we don't know. Was it a sellout? Was it 5,000 in attendance? We don't know. But the possibility, the potential for a lot of big crowds is there because of what I just explained.
Yeah, no, and I don't know exactly where I got this data point. I forgot to cite my sources, so take this as a grain of salt. But I even saw that he was in 30 bull ring main events as well in Spain, and a part of 2 stadium shows as well. So stadium shows, I have to imagine, is up to those sort of, what was it, 20,000 attendance, I believe you said. So I forgot to cite my source there, so that's on me. But apparently that is something that adds to it as well. But yeah, like there are big arenas on the way. I mean, talk about the rest of the card. I mean, George Gordienko on the ballot as well. You know, that new data points about matches he's had in Greece, right? Talking about these massive attendance shows that he's a part of is kind of like what allowed him to pop back up on the ballot last year. In the rest of the world. So yeah, it's not just the other thing. I mean, bringing it back to France, obviously you have the big seeders up until 59, and then the following year the new big seeder is 4600. So
in Paris.
In Paris. So and you know, Paris being the big city, I guess, for wrestling in France. Not just the capital, but a big important city as well. So like there are other places to go be big at, and the fact that, like, you know, he is a part of the sort of smaller buildings, but able to go to other arenas, other countries, wrestle on presumably these bigger stadiums like Spain, if my source is correct. That does showcase some sort of thing, I think, for Leduc in terms of drawing.
Yeah, and your source will be me, actually. So yeah.
Oh, did you say that? Did you write that? Like, say that from somewhere?
Yeah, probably, or someone did based on stuff that I've researched. So yeah, either way, it's me.
Like I said, at the end of the day, any knowledge and research I have stems from you. So that's a good thing and a bad thing, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. But to tie it all to Leduc, now Leduc specifically, again, we don't have numbers, but here's the potential numbers. I'll put it like this. I know that he headlined a couple of shows at least at the Hallenstadion. I just checked it in Zurich, Switzerland. Okay. So that's about 11, 12. Now in Spain, he headlined some shows at Pabellón del Deportes in Barcelona, which is about 10,000. At Las Arenas Bullring in Barcelona, 15,000. At the Bullring in Palma de Mallorca, 11, 12,000. At the Bullring in Valencia, and again, 11, 12,000. At Las Ventas Bullring in Madrid, which is 24. And interestingly enough, a couple of shows in 57 at Estadio Metropolitano in Madrid, which at the time I think was about 37,000. So the potential is there. If we had the numbers, we can make a case, but we don't. So that's really the big drawback to him. Just no numbers whatsoever.
I mean, even if we look at a way bigger project would be looking at the rest of those countries, look to see if we can find attendance data for the rest of those countries and see how the shows he was on, either main or semi-named, and how did they do comparative to other shows in those various countries. You know, did he have an impact on those other countries? Because if he did, that would again imply drawing capabilities in his home country of France, right? But that is a much larger project for a future thing, I guess.
But probably impossible as well. So
you know, that's the other thing. Well, look, I'm working on my time travel machine, Phil. So when I figure that out, I'll let you know. I'll let you know, and what we'll do with it is go to old wrestling shows and count the number of people. So yeah, we talked about this a lot when it came to like the Ted Boy Marino episode, because that had a different drawing case issue where it's wrestling in Brazil is basically studio wrestling. And that's kind of just what it is. So, but there are these sort of these shadows of drawing thing and shadows of being an important star and an important national star for Brazil. So there are these, I think to a certain degree, there are these other shadows that Leduc is a draw, is sort of an important figure in the history of French wrestling that sort of adds to it. But the problem is lack of data, and we'll have to wait basically another 20, 30 years for maybe data, which might not even exist.
True.
Let's talk about his wrestling. Which I think in a lot of ways is probably his strongest, because he is a great wrestler, to put it bluntly. I've seen a lot of people talk very, very highly of his wrestling capabilities. Even Tyler, I believe, and I saw in the VOW Discord, mentioned that he sees Leduc as a Hall of Fame level worker. Which is very good, obviously. I've seen a lot of people compare him, talking about him as a very effective technical wrestler. I've seen a lot of people compare him to Bret Hart. I've seen that name pop up countless times as a comparison point for Leduc.
Yep.
Obviously, I like I said, I've never seen Bret Hart spin on his head as a guy, but still a very that very effective technical wrestling we're talking about is locking in head scissors, locking in various holds, and not being totally flashy and being a good worker. A lot of this stems from his background as an amateur wrestler. He was seen as a shooter, as a real life shooter that can that you don't want to piss him off. Maybe that's why he had a lot of respect. I don't know. I imagine it played a part. But a very great wrestler in that sense. Famous, obviously, for both the escapes of head scissors, but then also the use of head scissors in his arsenal for Leduc. So that's just a quick rundown, I guess, of a lot of things. But but what do you think? How do you feel about Leduc's wrestling ability?
Yeah, this is his strongest point for sure. And I'll break it down because to me, when I was doing my research on him, it's just overwhelming in that direction. So I'll break it down like this. Now, first, we have the respect of his peers. Now, granted, I haven't asked and I haven't read the opinions of hundreds of French wrestlers, but I can tell you this. Pretty much every French wrestler that I've seen the opinion of, maybe about a dozen or so, or asked for an opinion, they all tell me Leduc was either the very best or one of the best. That's just universal across the board.
Yeah.
And actually, there is this particular quote by a wrestler by the name of Jean Corn, who was a well-accomplished wrestler himself. In the 1970s, he published a book called The Truth About Catch, where he talked about his career in wrestling in general. And in it, he has this quote, which I kind of love. He says, it's difficult to distribute places, but I think we can all agree Gilbert Leduc, there we go, Gilbert Leduc is the best wrestler France has ever seen. Yeah. Pro wrestler, I should say. So, I mean, that sort of respect right there, it doesn't come easy. And Bob Plantin, like I keep mentioning him, he said the same thing. His exact quote was of the heavyweights, of the light heavyweights, he was the best, but he's the only Frenchman he mentioned. So yeah, he essentially considers him the best Frenchman. Anyway, because the other lighter wrestlers he mentioned to me are not French. Anyway, in terms of who was the best. So that's from his peers. That's how he was viewed. So think about that. Then we have the press, which obviously gives us an idea of what basically the journalists viewed him as. Now, I'll disregard the French. Okay, we may say, okay, it's France, he's a local guy, bias, whatever. I'll throw this out. Let's look at Spain, which is another place where he wrestled for a long time, from 49 to 66, and where he also held titles, etc. So what you would often see in the Spanish press when you read the reports is a few things. A, they would say the best match of the night, Gilbert Leduc. Second, they would often call him phenomenal, sensational, those sorts of epithets, which they didn't necessarily use for other guys on the card. That's the thing. Also, later on in his career, they started calling him El Maestro de Maestros, which basically means the cream of the crop, more or less. But my favorite thing, and I remember when I came across it in my research in Barcelona, I was a bit taken aback by it. A number of articles I saw the writer calling him just straight up the best wrestler in Europe. Not the best French wrestler, not the best wrestler from the light heavyweights, the best wrestler in Europe, period. Wow. And this is coming from a Spanish writer talking about a French guy. And I remember thinking, why is he not putting over his local Spanish guys? Why is he saying it about this guy? So I remember being taken aback, but it wasn't just one article. It kept coming back in other articles, I think by the same author, but still. So that was very impressive to me. So we have his peers viewed him as one of the best, if not the very best. The press held him very highly as well. Then obviously we have, as we mentioned, he was Chouchou, the people's champion in France, people's favorite. So there's that. But let's take all of this out of the equation. Forget what people thought back in the day. Let's look at the footage. There is footage of him, luckily. And actually there is footage over 20 matches, ranging from 57 being the earliest full match we have, all the way to 1977. So that's a 20-year span. Yes. And on top of that, there are additional clips which are not readily available. I've seen them, I haven't, but from 1950 onward until 56, there are like 3-4 minutes of highlights of other matches, about a dozen or so. So those are pretty impressive as well. And I've posted some clips actually these past few days on Twitter. Anyway, so go back and look at the footage. Obviously, it's a footage from a long time ago, so you have to adjust your expectations. And obviously, actually not obviously, because a lot of people may not realize that French catch has its own kind of rhythm and structure. So don't expect to see a US-style structure or even a British-style structure. It was different. But if you go back and you watch it, this guy is fantastic. I mean, there's no question about it. He was, and Bret Hart is a great comparison. I would also throw out another one, that being Luthez, more of his era.
Sure.
Because he had that sort of similar reputation, like a stoic babyface, a wrestler's wrestler who A, was a capable shooter, B, a great worker in the ring, who took wrestling seriously, who didn't do any goofy stuff. It's just a wrestler's wrestler. And the thing with Leduc, two things to me personally stand out about him when it comes to his work. Well, three things now that I think about it. First of all, is his ability to adapt to any sort of opponent. Because if you look at the footage, we have him against other baby faces. We have him against your classic heels. We have him against monster heels. We have him when he was younger. We have him when he was older. He's always excellent. Even when he was older, he's still very good. He's never not good, even in his late 40s, early 50s. Obviously slower, but
and a consistent style as well, right? It's a style of wrestling that in those 20 years of footage, basically, it's like, oh, this is just the same guy. Yeah,
I mean, which to a point you could say could be viewed as a drawback. He's a guy who didn't really change his style much over time.
Sure.
That could be a drawback. But then again, Ric Flair didn't change his style much over time.
If it works, it works.
Yeah. But then again, some people may say, okay, well, you need to evolve. Well, each to their own. But that's the first thing about him. Now, the second thing, it's his fire. Now, in French catch in general, but him specifically, they have this, I don't want to say trope, but it's kind of a thing that they do often, where the heel would beat down the babyface or would do something dastardly, and then all of a sudden the babyface would explode and start wailing on the heel, just European uppercuts and big moves, etc. So Gilbert, I should say, was one of the best of that. He would just explode out of nowhere. I mean, I posted this great clip the other day where it's from early on in his career, where he against Jack Dale, where he starts doing European uppercuts to Jack Dale, and he's moving like a boxer, angling for position. So it really felt like this boxing knockout, and ultimately he knocked him out. And Dale was great at selling it, obviously. That was really what made it, but he had that fire. So he's a guy who, A, was always very believable, and B, he was a guy who you could believe was tough and who could knock guys out. And actually, to add another aspect to his game, so to speak, not so much his game, his presentation, especially when he was early on, he was also a big favorite of the women, because he was like a well-built guy, good-looking guy. So you have the women liking him for his look, then you have the guys liking him for his technique and his ability to, for lack of a better term, fuck guys up, more or less. So yeah, I mean, that's what he had going for him. And I had a third point, which is actually escaping my mind right now. Maybe you'll come back to me. But anyway, the floor is yours.
I was going to say that perhaps another point was his selling ability, which I thought was fantastic as well. I'm literally looking at the GIFs that you've posted about Leduc right now, and you're right. Obviously striking is so great. Obviously, a lot of it being from Dale and the selling ability, but his striking looks great. His forearms look fantastic. But you had one back here as far back. This is footage from 1950 where he's in was it some sort of like a bear hug or something, and he's just selling his back in a great way. And I've seen footage out there as well with what's the guy's name? Hanker.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah,
something like that. I think it was like German for the executioner or something like that.
Exactly.
Where he is like a sort of a monster heel type to a certain degree, and he gets like destroyed by him at various points in the match. And that selling is extremely realistic, and obviously, I think a lot of amateur wrestlers have a big leg up to that sort of selling, because I imagine they felt those pains in real life. Also as a boxer, but his selling is extremely realistic as well. And when you are a baby face, let's say a good guy, that is extremely important to put over these things. We talked about that the one wrestler where he has to basically does a stretcher job. It has to be so realistic that you are going to get phone calls from fans asking, is he actually hurt? Which says something to his performance as a seller.
Yeah, it does. Actually, a quick side note, you reminded me of something that's interesting to mention. Now, when Leduc got into the business, this was still when the Amateur Federation was in charge of things. So at that time, any Frenchman who wanted to become a professional wrestler, they couldn't unless they had 3 years of amateur experience prior to that. So that was a requirement. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, which France was kind of unique in that sense that, for example, in the US back in those days, 40s, 50s, I mean, were there any wrestling schools really?
Not that I recall.
Exactly. Usually what it would be, someone would bring you into the business, maybe train you a little bit, and then you would learn on the job. In France, it wasn't quite like that. Obviously, first you had your 3 years as an amateur, and then they had like gyms, which were like proper schools, and several of them where you could go and learn the pro style from other pros. So not only did you have all this amateur experience, but then you did all this pro training, and then you got into the profession. And to get into the profession at that time, because it was the Amateur Federation, you had to pass an exam where you actually show off your wrestling skill, and they weren't passing everyone. If you weren't good, they'll turn you down.
Yeah.
So in general, and this is kind of an overall point in terms of the French footage that we have, which obviously it's very, very high class. There's a reason for that. I mean, the barrier to entry was very high back then, and especially like in the late 40s, early 50s, and you had to be good to be in. Otherwise, you just wouldn't allow them.
Yeah. And the fact that we speak to longevity, we speak to titles, which, all these sort of things. The fact that he is seen as the cream of the crop, right? That, he is the best of his class, the best of all these things. Again, really showcases, I think, how highly skilled he was in the ring.
Yep.
Just a fantastic wrestler. Like we said, there's not a lot of footage out there, but it does span a good stretch of time, which does help a lot. I'm sure more footage would pop up, I was gonna say more newspapers, but that's not how newspapers work. Sure, more footage will pop up eventually, as time goes on. And that would only help his ultimate case. And I mean, I don't know how much more footage you necessarily need to see to understand it, but I'm sure even more footage down the line would help make it even clearer and for a lot of these, more historical cases, let's say. Yeah. Any other last bits you want to say overall about Leduc?
Not that I can think of. I mean, the only thing I can perhaps throw in here as I'm looking at my notes, it's good to mention that he wasn't just champion of like one division. He was champion over several. He was French and European and world welterweight champion. Then he was European middleweight champion. And then obviously there was the big light heavyweight run. So he went up class, and every class he went to, he was always the top guy, more or less. So in that division. So that's good to throw in there. But other than that, I think we've covered as much as we can cover today.
All right, great. Well, then before we go, again, Phil, thank you so much for being a part of this show. Your knowledge on this is outstanding, and I greatly appreciate it. But before we go, like we do with everyone else here, I do want to talk about not necessarily the rest of the ballot, but at the very least, the rest of the world ballot section that Gilbert Leduc is a part of. Obviously, there are 13 acts. You get 4 votes. I am slowly putting it in the private chat of our StreamYard link here, but I'm sure you probably vaguely know. And of course, like always, all my forming goes out the window. I'm sure you know of the acts, but in case you don't, they are here. I will list them for our audience at home. We have Jose Torres at the top of the pack, 49.8%. Spiros Arion, the Royal Brothers, Adrian Street, George Gordienko, Billy Joyce, Otto Vons, Dominic DeNucci, Killer Carl Cox, and of course, the newcomers this year, Gilbert Leduc. I have misspelled here, so ignore that. Not misspelled, but mistyped. Ignore that. Steve Gray, Ted Boy Marino, and Les Kellett. So I want to ask you here, of course, Phil. You get 4 votes. Who are you sort of thinking about right now?
Well, first, I got to go with my boy Torres. That's the first thing I have to say. And just a quick note about him. He's one of those guys, again, who now, for him, luckily, I should say, have some numbers, those being 3 crowds of 20,000 in Spain, which no one else in the history of Europe, other than a couple of other guys who are already in the Hall of Fame, have done. Mm-hmm. Again, limited data, but based on the data, that's it. So in that sense, and also he headlined so many shows in Spain and some in France, but so many big ones in Spain that I gotta believe that even if we don't have all the numbers, it was just overwhelming in that regard. So I have to go with him based on the aspect of the draw. Even though as a worker, he wasn't all that much, but hey, his whole deal was knocking guys out with his headbutts. It worked. People liked it. He was even known as the El Noqueador, which would be like the knockouter, if you will. So that was his deal. People loved it, so it's fine. Then after that, I'm always on the fence about him, but I think I'll probably would vote for Spiros Arion.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot to his case, drew in a bunch of places. I won't go into it. Everyone knows the story. He's been discussed. So I think I probably am leaning in that direction as well. I have to think about it a bit. And in the same kind of vein of thought, Gordienko is another one who's kind of right on the edge for me. But again, with him also, there's that lack of data as well. I mean, we do know some numbers, but not a ton. Yeah. Not a ton. And that's something you have to kind of keep in mind. And then it gets tricky. Mm-hmm. Now, I do like Ted Marino. I do. But again, there are some limitations there. I have to give it some proper thought and compare with the rest. But he is on my list as a potential. I do also have a relatively good opinion of DiNucci as well. He's kind of a border guy for me as well. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, I also kind of like Otto Vance as well.
Okay.
Not a ton, but there is something to him. I mean, I compare it to someone like an Adrian Street, oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, why Adrian Street is so high, I have an idea, but to me it's wrong. But anyway,
I've always theorized that I think like Adrian Street is the sort of like fly-in voter name, that he's like a recognizable name for a lot of people.
Exactly.
So like Johnny Saint was last year, and fucking Big Daddy. I think other cases there. I'm not going to touch that. I'm not going to touch that one. But that sort of thing. Yeah, that sort of thing where people see a name, and that's why, like, I think Adrian Street also had like a little bit of boost this year, I want to say, or 2024. So if I recall off the top of my head, so I just fear that he is a guy that may get like a lot of fly-in voters. The only other name I could think of is like Otto Vance or even like Les Kellett, just because of like Colt Cabana constantly talking about him.
Mm-hmm. And the other guys, they're mostly UK guys, and if I'm being honest here, I haven't done enough on them. I don't know enough about them to have a proper understanding. I'll need to look into them more. Sure. But maybe the Royal Brothers, maybe Kellett. I listened to the podcast with Ethan that you did. Great podcast, recommend it. But
I appreciate it.
He's not my vote. I'll say it like this.
Darn! We couldn't convert you. It's tough, because I think if I recall Ethan being like, no, I'm not going to vote for
him. Yeah, exactly. No, he's an interesting candidate for sure, though.
Yeah.
And now Leduc is an interesting one. I mean, I think I might go with him as well, just because I'm being a strategic voter here. Because I remember, now here's actually something in the interest of fairness. A few years ago when Tavares, Lange Blanc, Francisco Pino, Roger Delaporte, and André Bolega are on the ballot, that was by my suggestion. And I had actually pitched Leduc back then as well. But for whatever reason, Dave didn't put him on, which actually in hindsight was a good thing, because back then I didn't know as much. And after Dave put him, I went back and actually started doing more research on Leduc specifically. Mm-hmm. So that it wouldn't have been a good podcast 4 years ago. Let's just say this about him. So I think just because I think he's very, very much under risk of dropping out the first year, which is what happened to Bolet and Delaporte. I think I might place a strategic vote for him just for that, just to kind of give him a little bit of a nudge, encourage people to check him out. So I'm not saying I would. I'll give it some thought, but he's definitely someone I'm considering. And it even take out my personal bias here in my strategic voting. Even without that, he's still a very legitimate candidate, especially on the basis of his work, his reputation as a worker, obviously his longevity, and of course the big drawback being the lack of numbers, but it is what it is.
Lack of numbers, but suggestions of something. There's something there's some fruit on the vine of that sort of that data. I was going to ask you about that as the sort of how sort of Frenchmen do on the ballot. Obviously, you talk about Lange Blanc. 2021 pops up, gets 12%. 2022 drops immediately, and he's obviously still a big star during this period as well. How do you think that does? Do you think that is just sort of a lack of research sort of thing that we've kind of been talking about throughout the show, or do you think there is I don't know. Do you think do you think that there's just sort of a hurdle that Leduc has to overcome to really get there, maybe into the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, definitely. I think it would be similar because France in general and guys from there that were mostly known as they're just not familiar to the audience. I would assume when I say the audience, I mean the voting pool.
Yeah.
And Lange Blanc definitely had that. And the thing with him, and this is maybe I don't want to sound arrogant, maybe I had a little bit to do with it because I have written about him. I have pointed people towards the article about him, but that article only covers the peak of his career. It doesn't really cover all of it. So I don't know that people realize the whole of it because he's not a guy who has a very strong case, in my opinion. And I mean, definitely a bigger star than Leduc in France.
Yeah.
And other places as well. But anyway, the point is, yes, I do think that Leduc would have a hard time. Now, I'm curious to see, because there is footage of him, and the French catch footage has gotten some traction online over the years. So I'm curious to see how many of the voters are aware of that footage, and specifically of Leduc. Honestly, I don't think it will be that many, but who knows? Maybe the footage is more over than I realize. Who knows? Hopefully. But yeah, he'll definitely have a hard time. Definitely. I think so.
Yeah, well, shout out the Segunda Queda guys, specifically, I mean, all of them, but especially Matt D. He's a guy that's been uploading a lot of footage onto his YouTube channel. But obviously, I think he's still doing the French Catch Tuesdays, where he sort of goes through and reviews a lot of the French Catch matches that he finds and he's able to upload, if he needs to, and talks about it on the Segunda Queda blog. So shout out them, shout out Matt D, and like I said, like you said, like maybe those sort of things can help maybe at least start the traction, let's say, towards some sort of candidacy for Leduc here. Well, that is it for us here, I believe, on the ballot. Any last? I guess I'll say that. Any last talking bits about Leduc? Any last pushes? If you had to sum up his whole case real quickly for Leduc here, and then obviously as well, if you got any plugs, Phil, let the audience know. Obviously, there'll be stuff in the linked up for people, but if you got any plugs, you can please give that now.
Yeah, as far as final pushes, I mean, I've said it several times. I'll just summarize it again. Excellent worker. You don't have to take my word for it. Go watch the footage, judge for yourself. But I think that is his strongest attribute. If anything gets him in, it's that. I mean, I'll put it like this. If a guy like Johnny Kidd, and no offense to him, he's great. But if he can get in, Leduc has a case. I'll put it like this. Because he's every bit as good. Every bit as good. Different style, obviously. You can make a case that, he's even better, depending on your taste. But also, bigger star for longer, in more territories. Not as influential, perhaps, in in-ring, but still. I mean, you don't headline for that many years, if not be good and not put butts in seats. So yeah, that's my final push for Leduc. Just go watch it. Go to Segunda Queda and YouTube and just check them out. And for plugs, I mean, I don't really have anything to plug. If you want to follow me on Twitter, Phil_Lyons. If you want to see some of my research, just put it Phil Lyons Pro Wrestling History Research or something along those lines, it would show up. I mean, I have stuff on France, Spain, Russia, lots of places, Cuba, or randomly, and all sorts of stuff.
Can I ask you one? I want to ask you one last question. I want to really put you on the spot here.
Ooh.
Is there, you do a lot of research on a lot of the rest of the world. Is there somebody that you've been really pushing, Dave, like, Cuba, Russia, like those countries you just mentioned? Is there somebody that like you've been really pushing, Dave, to try to get on the ballot that you think deserves it?
Well, that's two questions. There are people who deserve it, but then there's people who have pushed. Actually,
Fair.
I haven't been. No, I explain it like this. Now, I haven't been pushing a lot, to be honest, lately, because I kind of the main guys that I wanted to push for, I pushed, and he put them all at once, which in hindsight might have been a mistake, but either way. But the point is, now I've told him this, and I've said this publicly. To me, when it comes to Europe specifically, all the best names are pre-1950.
Yeah.
All the best candidates. So they would have to go in as an automatic induction by him, which means someone would need to push for them, someone would need to write a bio, etc. So those are I can think of at least a dozen guys who I think should be on, but that's another topic for another day. Now, as far as guys to go on the ballot, nobody who I think is a must. I'll put it like this. I would love to see Blanc back at some point. That's for sure. I haven't pushed for it, but I would love to see it at some point, and maybe then we can spotlight him a bit more.
Yeah.
Other guys who I was just discussing this with Ethan Tyler. I mean, a guy, for example, who I'm big on, and he's got a kind of a similar case as Leduc, is a guy by the name of Modesto Alero from Spain. Now, he's not one of those guys who, if you talk to or you read if you talk to wrestlers from that era or you read the newspapers, they all go, this guy's the best. And he was a lightweight. Well, not most of his career, but I would say he was lightweight for half of his career. Then he was a middleweight, welterweight. So he moved up, but he's one of the same. And there is a little bit of footage of him. And he's just on the basis of being an excellent worker. I mean, Hall of Fame worker, no question about it. You can even see it. I mean, there's a match specifically against a wrestler by the name of Teddy Boy. Just look up that match. Modesto Alero, Teddy Boy. I mean, it's top level stuff. And the other thing about him, why I think he's a strong one, is because there was a character that they introduced in France, and then that character made its way across Europe by the name of Kamikaze, the Japanese suicide wrestler. And eventually there was a tag team, a pair of them, but the main one was Alero. And the interesting thing about that, now as a lightweight, he wasn't necessarily a main event guy when he was just himself, although he did headline some shows in Spain, potentially big crowds there. But specifically when he became Kamikaze, that was a main event gimmick. And the unique thing about it, and this is speaking of influence and being ahead of your time, things like that, the gimmick was that he's this kind of very explosive, very strange Japanese masked wrestler. But the thing was that, remember, Alero was at this point maybe a welterweight, and he was wrestling and defeating light heavyweights and heavyweights, which is something that really wasn't a thing in Europe back then. They were sticking to their weight divisions. And here comes this guy and his tag team partner eventually, and he's doing that. And he's not the babyface, he's the heel, which is even more crazy because normally you would think David Goliath, right? No, he's the heel. So in that sense, a very unique gimmick, very ahead of its time. Yeah. And he got copied all around, so there's some influence. So I think he's got a case there, mostly on the basis of the work rate. And also another work rate guy who I'm high on is Le Petit Prince, the Little Prince. Now, for anyone that's watched the catch footage, they would know immediately how good this guy is. I mean, talk about guys ahead of their time. I swear, just go back, watch his footage from the 60s or 70s, and he's doing things that you'll think they're from 2025. I mean, he's doing some mind-blowing stuff. Now, that said, he's not just spots or anything like that. He's excellent worker all around, but athletically, just way, way ahead of his time. If you think Satoru Sayama Tiger Mask was ahead of his time, go back and watch Le Petit Prince, because that guy was 20 years earlier. So on the basis of being that ahead of his time, I'm very strong on him as a potential case as well. He doesn't really have a case for drawing, but he was often used as an attraction, so there's something to it. And again, he wrestled for a long time, a lot of matches on TV. So that's another guy who I like myself. And I think those are the two main ones that I would say at this point.
Well, Phil, if they ever pop up on the ballot, an open invitation for you as well to talk about them. This has been a fantastic podcast for me. I loved learning all about this, learning all about French catch, learning more about Leduc. Like I said, audience surrogate is who I am here, and I hope that everyone at home learned a lot, just like I did through this podcast. Phil, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time out to talk about Gilbert Leduc on the ballot with me. So
Yep,
again, thank you very much.
You're getting there with the name, by the way. Great stuff. No, thank you for having me. I had a great time. I always enjoy talking history. So that was a great time.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, everybody, for listening to this month's episode of The Ballot. We'll be back next month talking about a whole nother wrestler. I have an idea of who that will be. Just be a matter of putting a guest together, possibly someone extremely modern, I guess you could say, compared to Leduc. So thank you, everybody, again, for listening to this month's episode of The Ballot. We'll see you all next time. Goodbye, everybody. This has been a Count Out Podcast. Ring Post Radio is the only show hosted by Ryan Knightsey and Scotty Edwards that talks about the entire world of professional wrestling. With new episodes coming out every Sunday, there is absolutely no reason to not listen to real, honest wrestling opinions from two crazy maniacs. Have a hot boy summer and listen along to Ring Post Radio every Sunday on the Count Out Network.